The morning of October 15th, 1910, dawned cold and gray over Chicago. A thick fog rolled in from Lake Michigan, swallowing the city's newest skyscrapers and reducing the bustling streets to ghostly corridors of muffled sound. At Union Station, the platform teemed with travelers, porters hauling steamer trunks and newsboys hawking papers with headlines about Roosevelt's latest political maneuvers. Train number 7, the overnight express to St. Louis, sat gleaming on track 9. Its black locomotive hissed steam into the autumn air, while passengers filed aboard the 7 passenger cars behind it. The conductor, a weathered man named Ernest Holloway, checked his pocket watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. 57 years old, with a gray mustache that drooped at the corners, Ernest had made this run 847 times. He knew every curve, every station, every signal light between Chicago and St. Louis. Among the passengers boarding that morning was Margaret Ashford, a young woman of 23 with auburn hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat adorned with peacock feathers. She carried a leather valise and wore a traveling suit of dark green wool. Margaret was fleeing, though she would never have used that word. She was seeking new opportunities in St. Louis, where her cousin had secured her a position as a governess. Behind her in Chicago, she left a broken engagement to a banker's son and the suffocating expectations of her mother's social ambitions. In the 3rd car, a salesman named Theodore Briggs settled into his seat with a satisfied grunt. Theodore sold farm equipment, modern mechanical reapers that he promised would revolutionize American agriculture. His sample case occupied the seat beside him, and his mind was already calculating commissions from the contracts he hoped to sign in St. Louis. He was a large man, prone to sweating even in cool weather, and he loosened his collar as the car began to warm with body heat. The Reverend Samuel Pierce took a window seat in the 4th car, his Bible resting on his lap. At 68, Samuel had devoted his life to ministry in Chicago's poorest neighborhoods, but now his health was failing. His daughter in St. Louis had insisted he come live with her family, and though Samuel's spirit rebelled at the idea of retirement, his body had made the decision for him. He watched the platform through rheumy eyes, committing to memory the city where he had baptized hundreds, married countless couples, and buried too many children taken by disease and poverty. Also aboard were the wealthy widow Catherine Vandermeer, traveling with her lady's maid, 2 brothers named Jack and Henry Coleman, rough men in work clothes who spoke little and watched everyone, a young married couple, the Harrisons, on their way to start a new life farming in Missouri, an immigrant Italian family, the Rossinis, who spoke almost no English but clutched their tickets like precious documents, and a dozen others, each with their own reasons for traveling south that October morning. At precisely 8:47 a.m., Ernest Holloway blew his whistle, waved his flag, and swung aboard. The locomotive's wheels began to turn, slowly at first, then building momentum. The train pulled away from Union Station, carrying its cargo of hopes, dreams, and destinations into the fog-shrouded morning. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The train rumbled through Chicago's industrial outskirts, past stockyards where the smell of cattle and blood hung heavy in the air, past factories belching smoke into the already gray sky. Passengers settled into their journeys, some reading newspapers, others gazing out windows, a few already dozing despite the early hour. Margaret Ashford opened her valise and removed a leather-bound journal. She uncapped her fountain pen and began to write. October 15th, 1910. I am leaving Chicago, perhaps forever. Mother will never forgive me for breaking the engagement to William, but I cannot marry a man I do not love, cannot spend my life pouring tea and attending charity luncheons while pretending to be satisfied. The train has just passed the stockyards. Even this smell, awful as it is, smells like freedom to me. Around 10:30 a.m., as the train approached Joliet, passengers noticed a curious phenomenon. The fog, which should have burned off by now, seemed to be thickening instead. It pressed against the windows like something solid, transforming the outside world into an impenetrable white void. The temperature inside the cars began to drop, and passengers reached for coats and shawls. Theodore Briggs tried to wipe condensation from his window, but found the moisture was on the outside, not the inside. Damned strange weather, he muttered to no one in particular. Reverend Pierce felt a prickling sensation along his spine, a feeling he had learned to trust over decades of spiritual work. Something was wrong, though he could not articulate what. He closed his eyes and began to pray silently. In the locomotive cab, Ernest Holloway frowned at the fog. In nearly 60 years of life, most of them spent on trains, he had never seen anything quite like this. The engineer, a younger man named Patrick Murphy, had slowed their speed to a crawl, afraid of missing signals in the whiteout conditions. "Should we stop?" Patrick asked, his Irish accent thick with nervousness. Ernest checked his pocket watch again. They were already running 20 minutes behind schedule. "No," he decided. "Keep going, but slow. We know this track like the backs of our hands." What Ernest didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the fog was no ordinary weather phenomenon. It was something else entirely, something that existed in the thin places where reality grew soft and permeable. If Ernest had been a man who believed in such things, he might have recognized it as the same kind of fog that had swallowed ships in the Bermuda Triangle, that had claimed entire villages in forgotten corners of the world, that had been written about in obscure folklore from a dozen different cultures. At 11:17 a.m., the train entered a long curve near Morris, Illinois. The fog here was so thick that Patrick couldn't see the track 5 feet ahead of the locomotive. Ernest stood beside him, one hand on the cab wall, peering uselessly into the white void. And then it happened. The change was subtle at first, a slight shift in the quality of light, a strange harmonic in the sound of the wheels on the rails. The passengers felt it as a wave of vertigo, as though the floor had suddenly tilted beneath them. Several cried out. Margaret's pen skittered across her journal page, leaving a jagged line of ink. The Italian mother clutched her children close, murmuring prayers in her native tongue. In the locomotive, every gauge suddenly spun wildly, the pressure gauge, the speedometer, the temperature readings all dancing meaninglessly. Patrick grabbed the brake lever, but it felt loose in his hand, disconnected from any actual mechanism. "Mother of God," Patrick whispered. The fog grew impossibly bright, a white so intense it hurt to look at. Then, just as suddenly, it faded to a soft, luminous gray. The train was still moving, still following tracks, but something fundamental had changed. Ernest stumbled to the window and stared out at a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and utterly wrong. They were still in Illinois. At least it looked like Illinois. But the cornfields they passed appeared different somehow, wilder, less cultivated. And in the distance, where small towns should have dotted the countryside, there was only empty prairie. In the passenger cars, people pressed their faces to windows, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The fog had lifted enough to reveal countryside, but it was countryside from another time, or perhaps another version of their time. Forests that had been logged decades ago stood tall and pristine. Farmhouses that should have been there simply weren't. The landscape looked almost prehistoric in its emptiness. "Where are we?" Catherine Vandermeer demanded of no one in particular, her cultured voice edged with panic. Her lady's maid, a practical woman named Rose, could only shake her head. "I don't know, ma'am. I surely don't know." Young Henry Harrison took his wife's hand. "It's just the fog playing tricks, Sarah. Playing tricks with the light. We'll reach the next station soon, and everything will be clear." But they didn't reach the next station. The train continued south, following tracks that shouldn't exist through a version of Illinois that nobody recognized. Hours passed. The sun, when they could see it through the thinning fog, seemed to arc across the sky too quickly or too slowly. Nobody could quite agree which. By evening, Ernest Holloway made his way through the passenger cars, trying to maintain calm despite his own mounting confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in each car, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "We've encountered some unusual weather conditions. We'll continue south to St. Louis. I expect we'll arrive sometime after dark, though we are running behind schedule." Theodore Briggs cornered him in the fourth car. "Behind schedule? We should have been in Bloomington hours ago, and what's wrong with the landscape? I've made this trip 50 times and I don't recognize anything out these windows." "The fog, sir," Ernest said firmly. "It's disorienting. Everything looks different in fog." "That's not fog," Theodore hissed. "That's something else. Something wrong." Reverend Pierce intervened, placing a gentle hand on Theodore's shoulder. "Let the conductor do his job, friend. Panic helps no one." But privately, Samuel shared Theodore's fears. He had felt the moment of transition, that sickening lurch that reminded him of descriptions he'd read of earthquake victims. The ground solid one moment, liquid the next. They had passed through something, or into something, and he suspected that finding their way back would not be simple. As night fell, the train's electric lights flickered to life, creating islands of illumination in the gathering darkness. Outside, the landscape had become completely alien. Instead of the small towns and farms that should have lined their route, they saw only wilderness, vast stretches of prairie occasionally broken by dense forests. And the stars, when they emerged, seemed brighter than they should be, harder, as though the train were traveling through a world without industrial smoke or city lights. In the locomotive, Patrick Murphy's hands trembled on the controls. "Mr. Holloway," he said when Ernest returned to the cab, "I don't know where we are. This isn't the track to St. Louis. This isn't any track I know. But we're following rails, and they're solid beneath us, and I don't know what else to do but keep going." Ernest placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then that's what we do. We keep going. These tracks lead somewhere. They must." But even as he said it, Ernest wondered if he believed his own words. In his coat pocket, his watch ticked steadily onward, measuring time that somehow felt different now, time that moved according to rules he no longer understood. The first morning in the strange new world dawned clear and cold. Passengers who had managed fitful sleep woke to find the train still in motion, still following its mysterious tracks through an endless wilderness. Those who hadn't slept, and there were many, looked haggard and frightened in the pale morning light. Ernest Holloway called an emergency meeting of the passengers in the dining car. 63 people crowded into the space meant for 40, standing shoulder to shoulder between tables still set with yesterday's china and silverware. The air smelled of fear sweat and the lingering odor of coffee gone cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ernest began, trying to project a confidence he absolutely did not feel, "I won't lie to you. Something extraordinary has happened. I don't know what or how, but we are clearly not where we should be." He paused as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "However, we are safe. The train is functioning properly. We have supplies, food, water, coal for the engine. Our best course of action is to continue following these tracks until we find civilization, or until the tracks end." "What if they don't end?" asked Jack Coleman, one of the rough brothers from the third car. His voice was hard, accusatory. "What if we just keep riding forever through this godforsaken wilderness?" "Then we stop," Ernest replied evenly. "We stop, we assess our situation, and we decide our next course of action. But for now, movement seems preferable to staying still in the middle of nowhere." Margaret Ashford raised her hand, a schoolgirl gesture that seemed absurd under the circumstances but somehow appropriate. "Mr. Holloway, do you think—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Do you think we've traveled through time? Or to another world? I've read Mr. Wells's stories, and this seems rather like—" "Let's not indulge in fantasy, miss," interrupted Catherine Vandermeer sharply. "I'm sure there's a perfectly rational explanation. We've simply become lost due to the fog and the conductor's incompetence. If you have a better explanation, madam, I'd be delighted to hear it." Ernest shot back, his patience fraying. "But I've been conducting trains for 30 years and I've never been lost. This is something else entirely." Reverend Pierce stood up slowly, his arthritic joints protesting. "Friends," he said in the gentle but commanding voice he'd used to calm countless congregations, "arguing among ourselves serves no purpose. We're all frightened. That's natural. But we're also alive, unharmed, and together. Let us be grateful for that, and let us support Mr. Holloway and his crew as they navigate this crisis." His words had a calming effect. The crowd settled somewhat, the panic ebbing if not disappearing entirely. Over the following days, a routine emerged. The train continued its journey south, or what they assumed was south, based on the sun's arc. The landscape slowly changed from prairie to rolling hills to dense forests unlike any they'd seen before. Occasionally they spotted animals, deer, elk, what might have been bears in the distance, but never any sign of human habitation. Theodore Briggs appointed himself the train's provisioner, taking inventory of their supplies. In addition to food meant for the dining car, they found stores of dry goods, canned items, even live chickens in a freight car that had apparently been bound for a farm in Missouri. "We have enough for perhaps 2 weeks if we're careful," Theodore reported. 3 weeks if we ration strictly." "And what happens after 3 weeks?" demanded Henry Coleman, Jack's quieter brother. "After 3 weeks we figure something else out," Theodore said grimly. Margaret found herself drawn to the Rossini family, the Italian immigrants who spoke little English but whose fear was universally understood. The mother, whose name Margaret learned was Lucia, had 2 children, a boy of about 8 named Marco, and a girl of 5 named Gina. The father, Antonio, had died 6 months earlier in a factory accident, and Lucia had been traveling to St. Louis to live with Antonio's brother. Using gestures and the few Italian words Margaret remembered from a college course, she communicated with Lucia, offering comfort and help with the children. In the face of incomprehensible terror, these small human connections became lifelines. On the fourth day, they saw their first structure, a bridge spanning a wide river. But this bridge had clearly been abandoned for years, possibly decades. Vines covered its iron trusses, and the wooden planking on its deck had rotted through in places. The train slowed to a crawl as Patrick carefully guided them across, everyone holding their breath until they reached solid ground on the far side. "How is that possible?" Sarah Harrison whispered to her husband. "That bridge was old, very old, but our tracks across it looked almost new." Nobody had an answer. By the end of the first week, supplies were running low enough that Ernest made a decision. When they spotted a forest thick with what appeared to be fruit trees, he ordered the train stopped. A foraging party was organized. Theodore, the Coleman brothers, young Henry Harrison, and a few other able-bodied men. Ernest gave them strict instructions. Stay together, don't wander far from the train, and return before sunset. They came back with baskets of apples, pears, and something that looked like wild grapes. More importantly, they reported seeing signs of old human habitation in the forest, foundations of buildings long since collapsed, what might have been a well-rusted farm equipment half buried in decades of leaf mold. "Someone lived here once," Jack Coleman said, staring at the fruit he'd picked, "but that was a long, long time ago." That night, around a fire they'd built beside the tracks, Reverend Pierce led a prayer service. People of all faiths and no faith gathered together, finding comfort in ritual and community. Margaret sat between Lucia and her children, holding little Gina on her lap, as the child finally cried herself to sleep. After the service, as people drifted back to the train, Ernest and Reverend Pierce remained by the fire. "What do you really think has happened to us?" Ernest asked quietly. Samuel stared into the flames for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that we have passed through a door that perhaps should not have been opened. I think we are in a place, or a time, between times. And I think, Mr. Holloway, that finding our way home may be the greatest challenge any of us will ever face." "Do you think we will find our way home?" "I think," Samuel said, still watching the fire, "that we must have faith. What other choice do we have?" The train continued its journey. Weeks became months. The landscape changed with bewildering speed, from autumn forests to snow-covered plains to spring meadows, sometimes all in the same week. The sun rose and set, but its path across the sky seemed inconsistent, as though they were traveling through pockets of different seasons, different climates, perhaps even different years. They developed a system for survival. When they needed food, they stopped to forage or hunt. Theodore proved surprisingly adept with a rifle, bringing down deer and wild turkeys. The women organized cooking rotations, stretching their meager supplies with foraged additions. Children, the young Rossinis and the Harrisons' infant son who'd been born healthy despite the bizarre circumstances, became the train's collective responsibility, everyone watching over them. Margaret discovered she had a talent for teaching. She began giving lessons to Marco and Gina Rossini, teaching them English. Soon other passengers joined, wanting to keep their minds occupied. She taught literature, history, even the basics of Latin. The dining car became a schoolroom in the mornings, a church in the evenings, and a gathering place whenever comfort was needed. But as months stretched into a year, then 2 years, despair began to creep in. Several elderly passengers died, Reverend Pierce among them, passing peacefully in his sleep during their second winter. They buried him beside the tracks, marking his grave with a cross fashioned from railroad ties. His Bible was passed to Margaret, who found herself taking over his role as the train's spiritual counselor, though she'd never considered herself particularly religious. Romance bloomed in the confined space of the train. Henry Harrison's wife Sarah gave birth to their second child. 2 other couples formed and married, with Ernest officiating in his role as conductor. Life, stubborn and persistent, continued even in the most impossible circumstances. Catherine Vandermeer's lady's maid, Rose, proved to have hidden depths. She knew wild plants, could predict weather, and had a practical competence that made her invaluable. When Catherine herself became ill with pneumonia during their 3rd winter, Rose nursed her back to health with herbs and stubborn determination. The class barriers that had defined their relationship in the old world gradually dissolved. They became simply 2 women, partners in survival. Theodore Briggs, the salesman, transformed from a somewhat pompous huckster into the train's de facto mayor. He organized work crews, mediated disputes, and kept meticulous records of their journey in a series of leather-bound ledgers. Where they'd traveled, what they'd seen, who they'd lost, who'd been born. All of it carefully documented in his neat, precise handwriting. Someone should know, he explained to Margaret once. Someday if we ever get home or if someone finds this train after we're all gone, they should know what happened to us. The train itself became a world unto itself, a mobile village traveling through the impossible. The passengers painted murals on the interior walls, created gardens and boxes on the observation platforms, even constructed a small workshop in one of the freight cars where they could repair tools and clothing. But always they moved forward, following the endless tracks through landscapes that made no sense. They saw things that shouldn't exist, forests of trees with silver bark, mountains that seemed to shimmer and shift, skies that occasionally flickered with colors that had no names. Once they passed through a region where the stars were different, constellations nobody recognized, arranged in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. "We're not just lost in space," Margaret said to Ernest one night as they stood on the rear platform, watching those alien stars. "We're lost in everything. Space, time, maybe even reality itself. And yet the tracks continue," Ernest replied. "They must lead somewhere. Or nowhere," Margaret said softly. "Perhaps they lead precisely nowhere. Perhaps we're doomed to ride forever, generation after generation, until we forget there was ever anything but this train and these tracks." But Ernest shook his head. "No, I don't believe that. These tracks were built by someone for something. They have a destination. We just have to find it." The breakthrough came in what they had calculated, somewhat arbitrarily, to be their 16th year of traveling. By then, the original passengers had been joined by children born on the train, 17 in total. The eldest, Sarah Harrison's son Thomas, was 15 years old and had no memory of any world but this one. To him and the other train-born children, the stories of Chicago and St. Louis were fairy tales, as distant and unreal as tales of Camelot. Margaret, now 39 years old, had become the train's unofficial leader alongside Ernest, who was in his 70s and increasingly frail. Her auburn hair had threads of gray and her face bore the lines of 16 years of uncertainty and survival. She still kept her journal, though the original leather-bound book had been filled years ago. Now she wrote on whatever paper they could make from processed plant fibers, binding her entries with cord. It was young Thomas Harrison who first spotted the tower. They had entered a region of unusual terrain, rolling hills covered in grass that shimmered like metal in the sunlight. The sky had taken on a peculiar bronze quality, and the air tasted of copper and ozone. The passengers had grown accustomed to such anomalies. They no longer even remarked on them, but the tower was different. It rose from the highest hill like a finger pointing at the sky, constructed of a material that seemed to be stone and metal, and something else entirely, something that shifted between states as you looked at it. It was impossibly tall, at least 1,000 feet, and covered in symbols that hurt the eyes, geometric patterns that seemed to move and reconfigure themselves even as you watched. "Mr. Holloway," Thomas called from his position on the observation platform. "Sir, you need to see this." Ernest made his way slowly to where the boy stood, his joints protesting every step. Margaret followed, and soon half the train's population was crowded onto the platforms, staring at the impossible structure. "What is it?" whispered young Marco Rossini, now a man of 24, married to one of the train-born girls and father to twin daughters. "I don't know," Margaret said, "but I think it might be our answer." Ernest made a decision. "We stop." For the first time in 16 years, the train came to a complete halt. Patrick Murphy, now in his late 40s and gray-haired, engaged the brakes with a squeal of metal. The sudden stillness felt wrong, unnatural. People stumbled, their bodies so accustomed to motion that standing still felt like falling. Ernest assembled an expedition. Margaret, Theodore Briggs, the Coleman brothers, Marco Rossini, and Thomas Harrison. They would hike to the tower while the train waited. If they didn't return in 3 days, the train would continue on without them. "Absolutely not," said Rose, Catherine's former maid. The old woman had died 2 years prior, and Rose had become one of the train's most respected members. "If you don't return, we're coming after you. We don't leave anyone behind, not after all this." Ernest smiled wearily. "As you say, Rose." They set out at dawn, carrying water, provisions, and a rifle. The grass that had looked metallic from a distance proved to be actual metal, thin strands of some copper-like substance growing from the earth like vegetation. It crunched beneath their feet and sang softly in the wind, creating an eerie harmony. The tower grew larger as they approached, revealing more of its impossible architecture. Stairs spiraled around its exterior, leading up to a platform near the top. The symbols covering its surface definitely moved, forming patterns and equations that seemed almost familiar, like mathematics from a dream. "It's a language," Margaret said suddenly. "Those symbols, they're trying to tell us something." Theodore pulled out his ledger and began sketching the symbols, trying to capture their patterns before they shifted again. "But what language? It's nothing I've ever seen." They reached the tower's base by mid-afternoon. Up close it was even more overwhelming, thrumming with a barely audible vibration that they felt in their bones. An opening stood before them, a doorway shaped like no door they'd ever seen, not quite rectangular, not quite oval, but something in between. Jack Coleman, always the brave or the foolish one depending on who you asked, stepped forward. "Well, we didn't come all this way to stand outside." The interior was a single vast chamber that somehow seemed larger than the tower's exterior dimensions should allow. The walls curved up and away, covered in more of the shifting symbols. In the center stood a device. There was no other word for it. Composed of rings within rings within rings, all rotating at different speeds, all made of that state-shifting material. "A machine," Thomas breathed. "It's a machine." Margaret approached it slowly, her heart pounding. As she drew near, the symbols on the walls began to change, moving faster, forming new patterns. And suddenly, impossibly, she could read them. Not with her eyes, with her mind. The meaning bypassed language entirely, flowing directly into her consciousness like water into a vessel. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh God." "What?" Ernest asked urgently. "Margaret, what do you see?" "It's a junction," she said, her voice distant. "A junction point. The tracks we've been following, they don't exist in normal space-time. They exist in the spaces between realities, connecting different whens and wheres. This machine regulates them, controls them, and it's what?" Theodore demanded. "It's broken," Margaret said. "Not badly, but damaged. Like a switch stuck between positions. And she looked at her companions with tears in her eyes. "We were on the train when the switch jammed. We've been riding the in-between, the space that connects all times and places for 16 years. Jack Coleman laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "So we're stuck? Is that what you're saying? We're stuck here forever?" "No," Margaret said slowly, studying the device with new understanding. "No, I don't think so. I think we can fix it." Over the next 2 days, Margaret worked with the machine while the others watched and helped as they could. The knowledge flowing from the symbols was intuitive rather than instructional. She didn't understand the mechanism rationally, but her hands seemed to know what to do. She adjusted rings, realigned what might have been gears, traced patterns on surfaces that responded to her touch like living things. On the second night, as she worked by lamplight, Ernest sat beside her. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if you fix this, if we get back, will we be home? Will we be in 1926? Margaret paused in her work. "I don't know," she admitted. "The machine doesn't care about time the way we do. It connects moments, not years. We might emerge anywhere, anywhen, but we'll emerge somewhere real. Not this in-between place?" "Yes," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "Yes, I believe so." On the morning of the third day, Margaret made the final adjustment. A ring clicked into place that had been askew. The entire machine shuddered, then began spinning in a new pattern, smoother, more harmonious. The symbols on the walls flared brilliant white, then settled into patterns that remained stable for the first time since they'd entered. "It's done," Margaret said, swaying with exhaustion. "We need to get back to the train." They ran. Later, none of them could quite remember the journey back, as though the landscape itself had cooperated to speed their return. They reached the train by late afternoon, and Margaret explained breathlessly what she'd done. "When we start moving again," she said, "the track should take us somewhere real, somewhere in our world. I don't know where or when, but somewhere that actually exists." "How will we know when to stop?" asked Rose. "We'll know," Margaret said. "The landscape will make sense again. There will be people, buildings, signs of civilization. We'll know." Ernest gave the order, and Patrick engaged the engine. The train began to move, slowly at first, then building speed. They left the metallic hills and the impossible tower behind. following the tracks into what they all hoped would be their salvation. The first signs appeared within hours. The landscape began to stabilize. Real forests, real rivers, real mountains. The sky returned to normal blue. The sun followed its proper path. And then, on the second day after leaving the tower, they saw it. A road sign. Weathered, faded, but unmistakably real. Springfield, Missouri, 15 miles. Thomas read aloud. It's real. It's an actual place. Cheering erupted throughout the train. People hugged, cried, laughed with relief that bordered on hysteria. They were coming home. After 16 years, they were finally coming home. But as the celebration continued, Ernest pulled Margaret aside. "Look at that sign," he said quietly. "Look at it closely." Margaret did, and felt her heart sink. The sign wasn't just weathered. It was old, very old. The style of lettering, the design, the material, none of it was from 1910, or even 1926. "What year do you think we're arriving in?" Ernest asked. "I don't know," Margaret whispered, "but I don't think it's when we left." The train rolled into Springfield, Missouri in the early morning hours of March 3, 1980. The date would later be confirmed by newspapers, by a calendar in the station master's office, by the bewildered faces of the people who witnessed a steam locomotive, an actual functioning steam locomotive, a model that hadn't been manufactured since 1912, pull into the freight yard on tracks that had been scheduled for demolition. But for now, for those first surreal moments, time itself seemed suspended as the passengers of train number 7 looked out their windows at a world transformed beyond recognition. What in God's name? Theodore Briggs pressed his face against the glass, staring at a parking lot full of automobiles unlike any he'd ever imagined. They were so smooth, so colorful, made of materials that caught the morning light like candy. Young Thomas Harrison, who had never seen a car at all, gasped in wonder. "Are those automobiles? But they're so wrong." His mother Sarah finished. "They're all wrong." Margaret stood on the rear platform, watching the modern world slide past. Buildings of steel and glass, power lines strung everywhere, signs advertising products with names that meant nothing to her. McDonald's, 7-Eleven, Walmart, and the lights. Even in the dawn light, electric signs blazed with colors and brilliance that seemed impossible. Ernest stood beside her, his face unreadable. At 73 years old, having spent the last 16 years of his life on this impossible journey, he had imagined homecoming in 1,000 different ways. Never like this. "We've traveled 70 years, he said quietly. 70 years in the space of one journey. Patrick Murphy brought the train to a stop, engaged the brakes, and then simply sat in the cab, staring at his hands. Those hands had controlled this locomotive for what felt like a lifetime. What did they do now? Within minutes, the yard was surrounded by vehicles. Police cars with flashing lights, fire trucks, an ambulance, and a growing crowd of onlookers drawn by the impossible sight. The authorities approached cautiously, guns drawn, treating the steam locomotive like a UFO that had landed in their midst. "You in the train," a voice called through a megaphone. "This is the Springfield Police Department. Exit the train slowly with your hands visible." Ernest descended first, moving with the careful deliberation of an elderly man. He raised his hands, his conductor's uniform, 16 years old but well-maintained, marking him clearly. Behind him came Margaret, then the others one by one. 63 adults ranging from their 30s to their 70s, 17 children and teenagers born on the train. All of them dressed in clothing from another era, all of them blinking in the bright lights like creatures emerging from a cave. The police officers' confusion was palpable. These weren't terrorists or criminals. They were ordinary people, mothers with children, elderly folks, working men and women. But their clothes, their manner, even the way they moved spoke of another time entirely. A young officer approached Ernest cautiously. "Sir, I'm Officer Davis. Can you tell me where this train came from?" Ernest laughed, a sound that held 16 years of weariness and wonder. "Officer Davis, I can tell you where we came from, but I don't think you'll believe me." "Try me," Davis said. "Chicago, Union Station, October 15th, 1910. Davis blinked. "Sir, that's not possible. That was 70 years ago." "I'm aware," Ernest said dryly. "We were scheduled to arrive in St. Louis later that same day. Obviously, we're running a bit behind schedule." The story unfolded slowly, amidst growing media frenzy and intense scrutiny from authorities who simply could not reconcile what they were seeing with what should be possible. Theodore's meticulously kept ledgers were examined. 16 years of daily entries documenting their journey through impossible places. Margaret's journals were read, her descriptions of alien landscapes and shifting realities analyzed by scholars and scientists who struggled to make sense of them. Medical examinations confirmed that these were real people with real histories. Their bodies showed the wear of hard living, but also anomalies, cellular markers that suggested they'd been exposed to forms of energy unknown to modern science. Carbon dating of their clothing and personal effects confirmed the items were indeed from 1910, yet showed signs of having existed far longer than 70 years. The train itself was a marvel and a mystery. Forensic examination revealed it to be exactly what it appeared to be: a 1908 Baldwin locomotive and 7 passenger cars, all in remarkably good condition despite impossible circumstances. The coal in its tender was of a type not seen since the early 20th century. The wood in the cars had grain patterns that experts swore were extinct species, but it was the tracks that proved most baffling. The train had arrived on rails that shouldn't exist, following a route that appeared on no maps. When investigators tried to trace the path backward, they found the tracks ended abruptly just outside Springfield, as though they'd simply materialized to allow the train passage. "It's like the universe bent itself to deliver them here," one physicist said in a television interview that Margaret watched from a hotel room provided by the authorities, as though reality itself wanted them to arrive. The passengers of train number 7 became instant celebrities, their story dominating news cycles worldwide. The train out of time, some called it. The lost generation, others dubbed them. Documentaries were filmed, books were written. Experts of every stripe offered theories ranging from scientific to supernatural. But for the passengers themselves, celebrity was the least of their concerns. They had to learn to live in a world 7 decades removed from the one they'd left. For those born on the train, it was the first solid ground they'd ever known, both literally and metaphorically. Margaret found herself appointed as the group's unofficial spokesperson, perhaps because she'd become their leader during the journey, or perhaps because she had a gift for articulating the incomprehensible. She gave interviews, answered questions, and tried to help her fellow passengers navigate a world of televisions, computers, interstate highways, and social changes that would have been unthinkable in 1910. "Women can vote now," a reporter told her during one interview. "You can own property, have careers, run for office." Margaret thought of her mother's expectations, of the engagement she'd fled, of the suffocating constraints she'd left behind. "I broke an engagement to seek freedom," she said quietly. "I ended up on a train that traveled for 16 years through impossible places, and now you're telling me I would have had that freedom anyway, if I'd just waited? Would you go back?" the reporter asked. "If you could return to 1910, knowing what you know now, would you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "No," she finally said, "because I would have missed the journey. And the journey, impossible as it was, made me who I am." Not all the passengers adapted well. Catherine Vandermeer's fortune had vanished decades ago. Jack Coleman struggled with the violence and chaos he saw on the nightly news, finding this new world more frightening than the alien landscapes they'd traveled through. Several of the elderly passengers simply couldn't cope with the displacement and retreated into memory, rarely speaking of anything but the train and their years of wandering. But others thrived. Marco Rossini became fascinated with computers, these machines that seemed like magic to him. Theodore Briggs, using the celebrity status and the compensation fund established by the government, started a business, not selling farm equipment, but telling their story, consulting on books and films, ensuring their experience was documented for history. Young Thomas Harrison enrolled in college at 16, his unusual education on the train having prepared him uniquely for learning. He studied physics, driven by a need to understand what had happened to them. His mother, Sarah, trained as a nurse, finding satisfaction in helping others after years of feeling helpless on the train. Ernest Holloway retired, officially this time, to a small house provided by the railroad company, more as a publicity gesture than from legal obligation, but he didn't care. He spent his days in a rocking chair on his porch, his pocket watch in his hand, watching a world he no longer quite recognized but was grateful to be part of. Margaret became an author and lecturer, her books about the journey becoming bestsellers. But her greatest work was the school she founded for displaced persons, anyone who felt out of time, out of place, unable to find their footing in a world that moved too fast. She called it the Traveler's Rest, and it became a sanctuary for souls adrift in time, 5 years after their arrival, on the anniversary of that impossible landing, all 80 survivors gathered at Union Station in Chicago. The station they'd left from no longer existed. It had been demolished in 1925 and replaced with a modern structure, but a plaque had been installed, commemorating their departure and their inexplicable return. Ernest Holloway, now 78 and frail, stood before the plaque with tears in his eyes. "We left Chicago 70 years ago, intending to reach St. Louis by evening," he said to the gathered crowd of passengers, officials, and reporters. "We arrived 70 years late in the wrong place in a world we didn't recognize. But we arrived. We survived," Margaret added, standing beside him. "Against all odds, through all impossibilities, we survived together. And perhaps that's the real miracle, not the journey itself, but the fact that we made it together." That night they held a private dinner in the very hotel where they'd first been housed upon arrival. Stories were shared, memories relived, tears shed for those lost along the way and for the strange, terrible, beautiful journey they'd shared. As the evening wound down, Theodore stood to make a toast. "To train number 7, he said, raising his glass. "The train that couldn't, shouldn't, and yet did. May we never forget the lessons of the journey, even as we learn to live in our destination." "To the journey," they echoed, glasses raised. Later, as people departed for their various homes, for they had all spread across the country by now, living their new lives, Margaret remained behind. She sat alone in the hotel's lobby, her journal open on her lap, trying to find words for what she felt. Young Thomas approached, now 21 years old, home from college on break. "Miss Ashford," he said. He'd never quite managed to call her anything else. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, Thomas?" "You fixed the machine in the tower. You made it possible for us to return. But I've been studying temporal mechanics and quantum theory, and I don't think the machine was actually broken." Margaret looked up at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think it did exactly what it was supposed to do. We were the ones out of place, out of time, but not because of an accident. I think," he hesitated, then pushed forward, "I think we were meant to take that journey. I think someone or something wanted us to see what we saw, learn what we learned." "But why?" Margaret whispered. Thomas smiled. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I'm dedicating my life to understanding the junction points, the spaces between realities. Because if we stumbled into one by accident, there must be others. And maybe, just maybe, they're not accidents at all." Margaret closed her journal and stood, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then I suppose the journey isn't really over, is it?" "No, Miss Ashford," Thomas said. "I don't think it ever is." 25 years later, in 2005, Ernest Holloway died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 98. His pocket watch, wound faithfully every day since 1910, was donated to the Smithsonian, where it sits in a special exhibition dedicated to the train and its passengers. Margaret lived to see the new millennium, dying at the age of 90 in 2007. Her journals, all of them, were published posthumously, providing the most complete account of their journey. The final entry, written the day before she died, read simply, "I set out from Chicago seeking freedom. I found it in the most unlikely place, on a train that traveled everywhere and nowhere, in the company of strangers who became family. If I had stayed, I would have had a comfortable life, but I would never have truly lived. I regret nothing." Of the original 63 passengers who left Chicago in 1910, the last died in 2015, Marco Rossini, at the age of 113. Before he passed, he gave a final interview, his mind still sharp despite his great age. "People always ask if we were afraid," he said, his English now perfect, but still carrying the musical cadence of his native Italian. "Of course we were afraid. Every day we were terrified, but we were also alive in a way I don't think anyone else has ever been. We lived between worlds, between moments, between possibilities. We saw things no human was meant to see. And when we came back, when we finally arrived in Springfield that morning, we brought something back with us." "What was that?" the interviewer asked. Marco smiled. "Wonder," he said. "Pure, undiluted wonder at the impossibility of existence itself, and the knowledge that reality is far stranger, far more beautiful, and far more malleable than anyone imagines." The train itself disappeared in 1985. It had been kept at a rail museum in Chicago, a popular attraction for tourists and scholars alike. But one morning, museum staff arrived to find the section of track where it had been displayed empty. No signs of theft, no tracks leading away, no evidence of how a full locomotive and 7 passenger cars could simply vanish. Some said it had returned to the spaces between realities, its journey not yet complete. Others claimed it was a publicity stunt, that the train was hidden somewhere ready to be discovered when interest flagged. But those who had ridden it knew better. The train had gone where it needed to go, would go where it needed to be. Perhaps it was carrying another group of passengers even now, on another impossible journey through the places between places. In Chicago, at Union Station, tourists still stop to read the plaque. They take photographs, they marvel at the story. They shake their heads at the impossibility of it all. But sometimes, late at night when the station is nearly empty, people swear they can hear it. The distant sound of a steam whistle, the rhythm of wheels on tracks that don't exist. The phantom echo of a train that left in 1910 and arrived 70 years later, carrying passengers who had learned the most important lesson of all: the journey is everything. The destination is simply where you stop to catch your breath before the next journey begins. And somewhere, in the spaces between moments, between possibilities, between the solid world and the dream of the world, train number 7 continues its eternal run, carrying those brave enough to board toward destinations they cannot imagine, through landscapes that should not exist, arriving always and never, everywhere and nowhere, exactly when and where they're meant to be. The tracks go on forever,